Epoxy inlay signs, nearly instant gratification because they're so easy to make. There's no steep learning curve. Even a beginner can get a pretty professional result on these things. I've made 50 or 60 of them, so I've learned what techniques and supplies and tools work for me. I'm going to show you all of those in this video. We'll first go through tools and materials, then design, then technique. Tools and supplies. I will tell you what the must-haves are and the nice-to-haves. I've got links in the description to all of these products. They're just for your convenience. I don't make any money off of them. I've got no affiliation with any of these providers. We're going to start off with the must-haves. You've got to have design software. I use Affinity Designer 2. Another good option is Shaper Studio. I do have another video on how to use Affinity Designer 2 if you're brand new to it. You need to have a CNC. My CNC is my favorite tool. The Shaper Origin handheld CNC router. Of course, you're going to need router bits. This is a 1/8 bit. That's something I use a lot on these signs. You might need even smaller than 1/8 depending on what your font is and how big your sign is. You're going to need epoxy or resin, and you're going to need hardener. I started with the Total Boat brand just because of their reputation. I didn't do any testing or anything like that, and I've just stuck with them because they work. I like to get the slow hardener. That gives you just more open time, more time to work with it. Maybe fewer bubbles on the slow hardener too. I kind of think so. The other thing I like about Total Boat is they come with these dispensers, so it gives you the epoxy in the right ratio. You're going to need pigment. I bought a set of 10 bottles from Total Boat. They work great. I'm sure there's cheaper options on Amazon. You don't use very much of this stuff, so even if you pay a fair amount for pigment up front, it's going to last a long, long time. Mixing cups, you'll need those. If you go with Total Boat, because they've got those dispensers, you don't have to measure it. You can just go with any kind of plastic cup, you know, from Walmart or whatever. If you don't have those dispensing cups, then you're probably going to need ones with little gradations, you know, so you can measure out the right amount of epoxy. You're going to need stir sticks, and that's just, you know, Walmart, craft store, or wherever. You're going to need some shellac. That's to keep the pigment from the epoxy from seeping through wood grain. You kind of seal it up with shellac. You're going to need a heat source, like a torch, a heat gun, or you can just use one, you know, one of those long lighters, just a log lighter. That's to pop the bubbles in the epoxy when the epoxy's curing. And a Morbid sander, and you're going to need sandpaper from about 60 grit to about 400 grit. You're going to need varnish for a couple of reasons. One, the epoxy won't be quite clear even at 400 grit, but the varnish will clear it right up, and the varnish will give you UV protection because epoxy is not UV resistant. Moving on to the nice to have but not necessary, I like to inject the epoxy with these little syringes, and they come with little tips on them. They're pretty cheap, and I think they actually help with the bubbles. I'll show you that technique when we get further on. All right, over here sitting on my shelf is a vacuum pot. I'm not even sure it's a nice to have. If you're having trouble with bubbles, you might try that, but it's about $200. And I did a little test on this video to show that it might be totally unnecessary. Good news is that designing for an epoxy inlay sign is a lot easier than designing for a standard wood inlay sign. I'm going to get into the reason for that in a little bit. Your first choice ought to be your font. This one I think is called Baskerville. And you can see over here that Baskerville has some sharp corners. A router bit's not going to be able to cut those sharp corners sharp because they're going to be inside cuts. A router bit can't fit all the way into that sharp corner. On the other one, this one over here, Bell MT, it's really only got one sharp corner. The rest of it is kind of round, and a router bit ought to be able to fit in that pretty well. I'm going to pause for a second here and just quickly say why, one reason why an epoxy inlay is so much easier than a traditional wood inlay. These inside corners, of course, since they're sharp inside corners, will not route as sharp corners. They will route as rounded corners with, you know, the radius depending on the radius of your router bit. If you're fine with that, and you just cut out this whole pocket and fill it with epoxy, you're done. If you want to do a wood inlay, you're not done because you'd actually have to go back to your file and round the outside corners to fit in these inside corners of the pocket. To work on the type here, I'm in something called the frame text tool, and that's what this, I just dragged out this frame and typed in my text. I'm going to start off by centering. I'm going to have to make them a little bit smaller, I think. This is 288. They need to be about 244. Yeah, that's going to be about right, because I've got to leave some room on the edges here. I've got a molding that's going to go around this. So I'm still not crazy about how that looks, and one of the reasons for that is I want to have more space between the letters. I want them to look just a little more gentle and relaxed. So the secret word for that is called kerning, and I'm going to show you how to do that in Affinity Designer 2. If you use a different design program, you can just go on Google and ask about kerning, K-E-R-N-I-N-G, in whatever your program is, and it'll point you to the right spot. In Affinity Designer 2, to get to the kerning control, you go to, if you can't see it on screen, you go to Window, Text, and Character, and you get this dialog box. If you look down here, there's something called Position and Transform, and it's got this thing that looks like a V and an A. They call it tracking, and so what you want to do is increase the tracking if you want to move those letters apart. And there they go. I'm going to move them apart quite a bit. When I'm in this frame text tool and I've got it highlighted, it's just acting like a word processor. I can delete stuff. If I have something misspelled, I can fix that. You know, I could add more lines, whatever I want to do. I'm just typing away on a keyboard. But I won't be able to keep it that way because the CNC will not be able to cut it unless I convert it to curves. So that's the critical thing I think a lot of people miss when they're trying to, you know, work with some text on their CNC. So it's called Convert to Curves. In Affinity Designer, there is a button that says Convert to Curves. I think in some other design programs they call it something different. But if you just Google Convert to Curves in, you know, whatever your program is, it'll come up with instructions on how to do it. To convert to curves, I want to be over here. Right now I'm in my text tool. I'm going to go over and I'm going to keep that layer active, but I want to go over here to my Move tool. And once I go to my Move tool, I've got something right up here. This box pops up that says Convert to Curves. So when I click that, if I now go down here, it's renamed this thing. It's no longer a single layer. It's renamed it Group. And if I click down, now I've got a bunch of things that are no longer letters. And as I click on each one, you can see a bunch of nodes, but I can no longer work on them like a word processor. That won't work. It's really all these are at this point. They are pictures of letters. They're no longer letters. It's annoying that you can't edit anymore, but you have to do it or your CNC will not be able to recognize it. Now I mentioned one thing I didn't like. I didn't like the spacing between the V and the A. So I can just go over here and grab this picture of a V, and I can just use my arrow keys. I've got it selected. I can just use my arrow keys and nudge it over. So I like that. That looks really nicely spaced on screen, and that will be the final look of my sign. I want to export all of the letters, you know, the pictures of letters that I've made, plus I want to export the rectangle that contains them all. That'll just make it easy to place the file in the shaper origin. There's a bunch of buttons you've got to click if you're not familiar with exporting from Affinity Designer 2 or any other major design program. You need to go in and get the right settings. I've actually got another video on that, avoiding mistakes, and I think the first thing in the avoiding mistakes video is how to export so you get a valid export that doesn't mess up your sizes. So anyways, I'm just going to export that. To get my file over to the shaper origin, I'm here in the Shaper Tools website under My Files. Click the file I want to upload, and I click upload, and there it is right at the top. So that will now show up in my shaper origin. I can go cut it. Here's my stock for my sign. It's a little bit longer than the size of my sign. I'll cut that off later. It's 1.25 inches wider, so I'm going to have to decide what my good edge is and rip off the bad edge. I also need to decide what side to make the sign on. This is just a one-sided sign. So if I see on this side, I've got a bunch of ugly knots and miscoloring and so on. And this side looks a lot cleaner. So I'm going to want my sign on this side. And then if I look at it, which edge do I want to keep? I think this is pretty clean. Down here, I've got kind of a knot, and I don't know if that's a crack or something down there. So if I have a 5-inch sign, you know, I'll be able to cut off some of the kind of objectionable stuff in the bottom of this. So I'm going to make this my good edge. I'll go straighten that on the jointer and then rip this one down. Another tip on stock preparation, you really need to do a test. If you're using a wood for the first time, just make a small sign. Just one letter is all you need to do. And then you can test that wood to see if the pigment from the epoxy bleeds into the grain of the wood. On this one it did, and you can see the little subtle lines, but it really kind of wrecks the sign. So, you know, this would not be an appropriate wood to use for a sign, or I'd have to seal it with, you know, something like penetrating epoxy before using it. I've got my sign stock set up in the Z sled for cutting. Made sure that my good edge is at the top and my good side is up, just so that's how I know I'm going to orient the sign how I want it. If you don't have a Z sled, you know, I'm not using the Z sled because I need to in this situation. It's just a convenience. It works just as well just to have a 3/4 inch tape board and your board, you know, fastened down to your workbench and you cut away on it. Scanning and gridding is the same for any other shape or origin project, and it's important when you place your file to do that with a grid. You can't trust the visual orientation on a file when you're looking at it in the shape or origin screen. So with no offset, the R won't cut completely. It won't cut at all in this kind of little narrow section right there. So I'm going to try adding some negative offset. 0.005 negative. Done. So that's better, and it goes all the way around but doesn't kind of get into this little corner over here. So I'm kind of try to increase that offset. Let's try 0.007. Done. That gets it pretty good. You know, I'm still got this little corner that's not cut, but that's fine. If you're going to use an offset on any letter, it's important to use the same offset on all letters. If you don't, the ability to use on-tool offsets as you're making an epoxy inlay is a big advantage over wood inlays. You just really couldn't do that with a wood inlay without going back and completely redoing the positive part that's supposed to fit in the pocket. The upshot is you don't have to be nearly as careful when you're designing an epoxy inlay because you can just adjust it on tool to make sure that the router bit fits in what you want to cut. All right, the lettering's all cut out. I think it looks pretty nice. What we're going to do now is put a coat of shellac on this, and there's two reasons for that. Reason one is the shellac is going to help keep the pigment from the epoxy from soaking into the grain, because that would look pretty ugly to have little streaks of, you know, black pigment flowing along the grain. And two, it might help, I think, a little bit with bubbles kind of popping up through the epoxy. So anyways, it needs to be done. I like to just put a coat of shellac over the whole thing. You could probably get away with just doing the pockets, but you know, my theory is as I'm sanding it off, in case, you know, all the shellac doesn't come off, I want it consistent through the whole thing. Along those lines, if you go to your hardware store, there's two kinds of shellac. This one, I mean, this is a pretty common brand. This may be exactly what you see. This is the Zinsser shellac. This one doesn't say it, but it has wax in it, which might or might not be consistent with whatever final finish coat you're going to use. So if you can use this stuff instead, this is Seal Coat. It's also shellac, and it just calls it Universal Sanding Sealer. But down here it says, in this little type down here, it says 100% wax-free shellac. So this one isn't going to interfere with whatever final finish you use. Will it matter? Probably not, because you're probably going to sand all the stuff off anyways. But out of caution, I use this stuff. There's a little flaw here. I'm just going to leave it. It's just a knot that intersects the letter. If you really wanted a super professional sign, you know, get some wood that's cleaner than that. But I'm going to leave it, even though a little bit of the epoxy is going to flow into that knot. You want to make sure the sign is more or less level before you pour the epoxy. So I haven't mixed it yet. I'm just making sure it's all laid out. And you can see that my table is not exactly level. There's some high and low spots, but that's close enough for what we're doing. When I was up at the house at the computer, I had the design program calculate the square inches of this, you know, these pockets I've cut for the letters. It came up with about 5 square inches. This is 1/8 of an inch deep. So that's 5/8 cubic inches, and to convert that to cubic centimeters, I multiply 5/8 by 16.5. That's the formula to get cubic centimeters. That gets me a shade over 10 cubic centimeters. And the way this total boat epoxy works is for every squirt of this handle, I'll get 20 cc's. That's the resin. For the hardener of one squirt, I'll get 10 cc's. So I'm just gonna mix up 30 cc's. It's way more than I need, but it'll be enough to do all the letters and, you know, a bunch to throw in the trash. And we'll see if it starts right away. Yeah, it does. So that's a pretty good measurement, right? If it hadn't started dispensing right away when I pushed down, I, you know, would have wanted to wait till it starts dispensing and then, you know, get a new cup and try a new dose. So here's the hardener. And I think I ought to be okay with that. And I think this is just going to take a couple of drops, 2 or 3 drops. I don't know. We'll see. 1, 2, 3. I don't know, something like that. We'll see if that gets it nice and black. Total Boat tells me I've got 40 minutes of open time till it starts to gel, and that's at, I forget what temperature, like 65 or something, I don't know. It's a little bit warmer than that now, so I probably don't have quite that long. I've seen a lot of stuff that says when you're mixing, you should, you know, mix really gently so you don't mix any bubbles into it. And I've never had luck with that, so I just mix away, you know, pretty vigorously because I want it to get fully mixed and really make sure I scrape the sides so I don't have any unmixed epoxy kind of floating around. You know, I scrape the bottom, scrape the side, but I think that's pretty good in terms of a mix. And what I do, what I've noticed is when I'm pulling the epoxy up, bubbles actually form at the top of the epoxy because I'm really pulling a vacuum here to pull this epoxy up, right? So it's almost like this is a little mini vacuum pot. Now, if I haven't degassed the epoxy before this step, I get a lot more bubbles this way. But what I'm going to do when I pour the epoxy in is I'm going to stop pouring before I pour the last third of what's in the syringe. And I found by doing that, a lot of the bubbles that got pulled stay in the syringe. My goal when I'm filling these things in is to have the epoxy crown a bit. That way when I'm sanding them down, I'm just going to be sanding epoxy and not sanding a bunch of wood. It's okay if some leaks over the side, but, you know, better if you know, less cleanup. It's no big deal if some leaks on the side. Don't forget to dot the I. Getting fairly close to that, you know, 1/3. So I'm going to go in and just get some more resin from the bottom of the resin cup. And by so doing, I'm going to keep from squirting bubbles into my beautiful sign. I should also mention that if you have upward pressure on the plunger and you pull it out of the epoxy, you'll get bubbles that way too. It's good to avoid that. So let loose on the upward pressure before you extract the needle from the epoxy. I guess the other reason I'm going to be using more than 10 cc's is, you know, I'm having these crown over the top. So you do want to leave, you know, don't try to hit the amount of epoxy exact. Just use it as an estimate and, you know, round everything up. The next thing you want to concern yourself with is bubbles. And to deal with bubbles, you want to apply a little bit of heat to the top of it. Now, I can't see any bubbles in this, which, you know, I'm using the pressure pot. I should take care of bubbles. You could use a torch to create some heat to deal with bubbles. You could use just, you know, a lighter, one of those big lighters or something. Or you could use a heat gun. And I'm going to use a heat gun on mine. It's a good idea to check back every few minutes. It'll take a while for bubbles to rise to the surface. So I'm just gonna shut down and come back every couple of minutes and squirt it with some more heat. All right, a drum sander is a nice to have. It's not an essential. I like it because the epoxy is harder than the surrounding wood. So if I can bring that epoxy down to the level of the wood, there's less risk of gouging the wood. But if you don't have a drum sander, you can use a random orbit sander. It works just fine. All right, I'm ready to sand here. I've got it set up. Since I used the drum sander, I'm gonna start with 120 grit. If you didn't have a drum sander, you'd want to start with 60 grit and just go through all the grits. I'm going to go all the way up to 400. It's sanded all the way to 400, but you can see it's still cloudy looking on the letters. But if you want a preview of what it's going to look like when it's varnished, you can just wet some denatured alcohol on a rag. And there it shows up really black and nice and sharp. So you can just see that'll look super when it's varnished. There's no bubbles at all, and it just turned out perfect. And there was no bleed into the grain of the wood either. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better sign. Sign's done except for the varnishing. You varnish for two reasons. One, to make the letters shiny. You could keep going to higher and higher grits and eventually it'd get shiny, but it's easier just to use some varnish. And if it's going to be outside, you'll need the varnish anyways because epoxy is not UV resistant. So you need a varnish that is UV resistant to keep the epoxy in good shape outdoors. The two kinds of varnish I like, a couple of them, they're very similar. This one's called Halcyon from Total Boat, water-based, no pigment, so I like that. And here's a Minwax acrylic. You can just get this from your local hardware store probably. And I haven't really done a side-by-side of this and the Halcyon. I don't know which is better. They're both fine. This is what I've got, that's what I'm gonna use. I'll varnish the back of the sign first, then flip it over. I'm going to use Halcyon on it. So the deal with the Halcyon is you use gloss for all but your final coat. If you want satin for your final coat, and then you can use satin for your final coat. If you use satin for multiple coats, it'll get cloudier and cloudier. I do like satin, but this is a coat of gloss, and I'm probably just going to use 2 coats on this thing. I'm not going to get too excited about it. These signs are not out, all the time. They're just going to go out. This one in particular is just going to go out when we're having an event here, just to tell people, hey, it's private, don't walk into this area. I am going to make a bit of molding to go around this too, so I'll probably end up putting another coat once I have the molding made. One benefit of the Total Boat product is you can recoat after an hour, and as long as you recoat within 12 hours, you don't have to sand. So it's quite convenient. You can really get your full finish on in a day. This is my little test. This side used the vacuum, and this side did not use the vacuum. Right at this stage before standing, they look exactly the same. I have a feeling that this test is not going to be good for the vacuum pot sellers of the world. I don't think it's going to convince anybody to buy one. So regarding bubbles, there's no difference between the two. This is the vacuum one. It's perfect, no bubbles. This is the non-vacuum one. It's also perfect, no bubbles. You can ignore that difference in color down there. I just sanded it really thin, trying to get rid of that bleed through. But at least on this project, you don't need a vacuum pot. I was very lucky to not get any bubbles on this project, but that didn't leave me an opportunity to show you what to do if you do get bubbles. So I made a bubble. I just used a 16th inch drill bit, and I ran a little sanding over it, and this is how they look, right? The little bubbles get filled with sawdust. And so the way you fix them is we're going to fill that hole with, let me make sure that shows on screen. with this, there we go, medium thick CA glue, black. What you want to do before you do that is try to get the sawdust out. I just blew on it, that got it out pretty good, I think. Yeah, that's good enough. And then you just put a drip of the CA glue in there. And try not to go crazy because it's just more stuff to sand off, but that's too much, but oh well. You probably could be more careful just with a better applicator tip. This one's got sawed off from getting used on so many other projects. But if you had a narrower tip, you'd be able to direct that a little bit better. So then I just spray a little accelerator on it, wait around a bit for it to cure. Here's the finished sign. It's got its simple molding. It's hanging on a hanger of whatever aspen branches I could find sitting around the place. The only thing that might be considered a flaw in this sign is that little knot I pointed out earlier. It's over by the A, but it's really not objectionable on the final sign. Of course, I invite you to like and subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. That's kind of the most enjoyable thing for me about the whole channel. So hope to see you down in the comments and hope to see you back here soon. Bye now.